Good morning, everyone. My name is Taylor Bachrach. I'm the Member of Parliament for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, and I serve as the NDP's Federal Transport Critic. I want to begin by acknowledging the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and thank all of you for being here today. We're here today to respond to the Transportation Safety Board's final investigation report, which was released moments ago here in Vancouver. This is an investigation into the 2021 sinking of the tugboat Ingenika near Kitimat, which took the lives of mariners Troy Pearson and Charley Cragg. We're here today in the memory of Troy and Charley. We're here today in solidarity with all of the mariners who work up and down our coast every day in all kinds of conditions. I'll serve as our MC for this press conference. I'm joined today by a number of people, joined by Charley's mother, Genevieve Cragg, Charley's father, Phil Cragg, Troy's widow, Judy Carlick Pearson, Jason Woods, the president of ILWU Local 400, which represents tugboat workers on our coast, many of them. As well, we're joined today by Rob Ashton, the national president of ILWU Canada, and by Peter LaHaye, the national coordinator for the International Transport Workers Federation. Some quick housekeeping. We're going to hear from the speakers one at a time. I'll introduce them. We're going to have questions afterwards from the media. We do have a Zoom call started up, so we're going to do our very best to take questions from Zoom as well. So once the speakers have finished, we'll take questions from those here in person, and then we'll go to those who have joined us by Zoom. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Jason Woods, the president of ILWU Local 400. Jason.
Hi there. Thanks for coming. Jason Woods, president of International Longshore Warehouse Union. WODS is my last name. JASON for first name. Thank you for coming today. It's a lovely day. The weather's turned out for us, but I wish we'd be anywhere here but here discussing the loss of Troy and Charley. But here we are. After hearing the TSB this morning, we wholeheartedly agree with the recommendations. This sector, this under tonnage, 15-ton vessel industry here in BC, there were over 1,000 commercial vessels. None of them bear any scrutiny. None of them are inspected. Today you see commercial vessels or commercial trucks driving down your streets. You see trains, you see planes. All of them are inspected at one point or another by provincial or federal regulatory agencies. On the marine side, it's the Wild West. The Ingenika was in service for 50 years and was never, ever inspected by any regulatory regime. It's a shame. These lives didn't have to be lost in the way that they were. Basic due diligence would have stopped this accident from happening. They say that safety is a Swiss cheese model and the holes have to line up for an accident to happen. But unfortunately, in this circumstances, the holes were so big, the risks were so known, and nothing was accounted for. These lives were lost tragically for the commercial interests of Rio Tinto, for Wainwright Marine. At no point were the mariners even thought of. They weren't given the proper PPE. EPIRBs didn't work, which are electronic positioning buoys when your tug sinks that would have assisted in the rescue. Their survival suits were deficient, not maintained, not looked after. Would you send someone to drive down your streets without a driver's license? Would you send a commercial pilot to fly you and your loved ones to where you need to go without a certificate? This is the kind of industry that we have. No scrutiny, very little assistance from government. Transport Canada needs to do their job, and that's inspect all commercial vessels. The minister needs to be brave. We can't wait years like in the field disaster. On the rail side, we need this change now. The minister could order it today. 2 years later, we see a voluntary compliance program where 88 vessels in Canada have registered out of over 1,300. Is that an effective program to make mariners safer here in British Columbia and across Canada? I would argue no. Canada is a very rich country. 50% of our trade comes through the West Coast ports. Our members, the seafarers of British Columbia, keep that supply chain open, keep the goods and economy moving through storm, through tough weather, difficult times, away from our family, away from the people that we care about. We need that support from the federal and provincial governments. It needs to happen. It needs to happen now. I want to really thank everyone for your attention and keeping this in the public interest. Without the media, without the public support, we would not be here today. 2 years later, we mourn the deaths of Troy and Charley, but we fight like hell for the future and for other mariners that work up and down this coast. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Next, we'll hear from Charley Craig's mother, Genevieve Cragg. Genevieve.
Thank you, Taylor, and I want to make sure everybody can hear me. Charley and Troy suffered violent deaths. All three men went through terrifying hell that night. Zach survived, but only because he had an angel watching over him. The 4 recommendations which the board has put forward to Transport Canada are strong. It is now in Minister Algabar's hands to fulfill his promise in making the marine industry the safest in Canada. The report shows that the board has made previous recommendations to Transport Canada in 6 incidents involving tugs under 15 gross tons. Each previous recommendation lists findings that include inadequate safety, which can lead to operational risk, and even specifically spell out a risk to lives. Charley and Troy paid the highest price with their lives to make change happen. These recommendations announced today by the board are critical and cannot afford any further delay. It has been 2 years since we've lost Charley and Troy, and not one actionable item has been implemented. Any response from the minister on these recommendations, which includes words like voluntary, proposed, or continue to review, will not save lives and prevent injury or damage. What happened to Charley, Troy, and Zach, what he had to go through, was 100% predictable and 100% preventable. In other trades, such as construction and forestry, if there's a fatality in the workplace, it's tools down and operations are halted until thorough internal and external investigations are complete to ensure everything is safe. No time or revenue was lost. Sorry. In trucking, all commercial vehicles must be inspected annually. The report tells us that these tugs under 15 gross tons represent the largest segment in Canada, and they are all in BC. Transport Canada has not invested in the required safety of these tugs and the crew that works on them. It is time. The mandatory inspections for these tugs under 15 gross tons will address critical safety issues such as tug stability. Risk assessment prior to each trip will address issues around safe manning and crew and tug suitability. The Ingenika did not have the bollard pole required for that job that night, as was determined by TSB investigators. The forecasted gale force weather conditions and freezing spray was not calculated. The Ingenika had never been inspected in its 50 years of service. Like many of these artificially measured small old tugs still in service, it was grandfathered from current measurement rules that allowed it to stay under 15 gross tons. Without inspection, these tugs will continue to be a risk to your husband, to your wife, to your son, and your daughter who are working on them. Transport Canada's voluntary small vessel compliance program and voluntary safety management system will not address what can be uncovered to prevent injury and save lives, such as mandatory inspections and mandatory risk assessments prior to each trip for these tugs under 15 gross tons. In comparison to Transport Canada's $62,000 in penalty to Wainwright Marine and Bates Properties, UK's Marine Accident Investigation Branch imposed a fine of £2.4 million to Schweitzer Marine, who pleaded guilty in their part of safety negligence that led to the death of a tugboat crew member. Crown prosecution has filed 8 charges thus far against James Bates and Wainwright Marine, which fall under the Criminal Code of the Workers' Compensation Act and Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. However, a penalty of $777,000 and 6 months in jail will not send a message to industry that safety for all mariners is a priority over the risk of the cost of doing business. Charley was someone who always looked out for others. He was a mentor to many, and it is alongside his spirit that I will carry out to do what he would do himself.
Thank you, Genevieve. Next, we'll hear from Judy Carlick-Pearson, Troy's widow.
Thank you, Genevieve, for all the facts and the notes over the 2 years, and we've all the accumulated information that we've had to do over the last 2 years it's unbearable. And looking at the details of how your loved one dies is something that no one should have to go through. This document here is a play-by-play of how Charley and Troy vanished. Canada has to do better. Transport Canada has to do better. The PPA has to do better. You need to be diligent about these systems and not forget about all vessels that are covered under those policies. Who would have thought that Charley and Troy would go out one day and never come back? Troy's life suit was 24 years old. Within the document, it shows that their life suits weren't maintained. After 10 years, you're supposed to either get them refitted or throw them away. So we're talking 2.5 times, and they didn't do anything about it. Their lives could have been saved had we structured all the policies like everyone else, like all the other vessels. The PPA shouldn't have had given clearance that night. There's so much blame to be had, but at the same time, we have to continue to fight for the survivors that are out there that are risking their lives to go on the waters. Fight for change. Make sure these recommendations are put in place that protect your loved ones, that strive and have a passion to be mariners like my son. I'd just like to say thank you for your support in the last 2 years. We have the strength of Charley and Troy and many others. So together, let's keep making noise on this and put some pressure on the government to make these recommendations come to life so we don't have to do this again. Doiksinu.
Thank you, Judy. Today is International Women's Day, and I can't tell you what an honor it's been to stand alongside these two incredible women who are fighting for change. They're truly, truly incredible folks, and the legacy that they're working towards is going to make our province a safer place for all of the people who work on our coast. Reading through the transportation Reading through the TSB's report, the description of what happened, the only word I can think of is infuriating. Infuriating to reflect on the negligence of a company that did not protect its workers. Infuriating to reflect on a government that has known about these shortcomings in safety in this industry for years and yet has not acted. The measures they have put in place have not been effective. They have not been strong enough. Voluntary measures are not enough to protect workers, and we need better. This is a message for Omar Alghabra, Canada's Transport Minister. We demand that you implement all of these recommendations immediately, that you increase the capacity of Transport Canada, and that you put proper fines in place so that companies that flout the regulations are held accountable. This is also a message for James Bates, who owned the tugboat that these men were sailing on. What happened was completely unacceptable. Those two mariners should be here with us today. It's disgusting. So our hearts today go out to Troy and Charley's families. We want to see change. We want to see strong rules put in place. We want to see strong enforcement. I want to acknowledge the work of the Transportation Safety Board, the work of Kathleen Fox, and I hope that the implementation of these recommendations occurs swiftly. I was reflecting on some news coverage of the massive rail disaster in Ohio and read some comments from Ms. Fox about the pace of change when it comes to implementing the recommendations of the TSB in the rail industry, when it comes to braking systems and other safety precautions. She said that the pace of change has been far too slow. We can't afford that any longer, whether it's the marine industry, whether it's the rail industry. When Canada's safety investigative body makes recommendations, they must be taken incredibly seriously and immediately implemented. That's what I'm going to be pushing for in Ottawa, and that's what we're going to work together to ensure happens. With that, I'm going to ask if any of the reporters here today have questions, and following that we'll go to Zoom. And if you could indicate which outlet you're with and who you would like to direct your question to. And for folks on Zoom, if you can put up your hands if you would like to ask questions, and I think maybe we can ask Margaret to monitor the Zoom in terms of people's hands.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to do our best. It's always a bit of a challenge. Right here.
Zach Napatayi. The TSB's role obviously isn't to assign blame, but they did find what they described as inconsistencies of how Wainwright Marine maintained safety on board. Our understanding is that Charley, for example, didn't even have a safety drill before he went out on the water. I'm wondering if you think there's a case to be made for a charge under Westray, given what we've learned today.
Yeah, the Westray Act was brought in after a huge disaster in Nova Scotia, and it was meant to hold the companies and the people behind the companies accountable, legally accountable, when workers die. Kill a worker, go to jail, as the saying goes, and yet we've seen it used far too infrequently in Canada. Now, our justice system is independent, and I'm going to let it do its work. However, we need accountability, and when companies act negligently, they need to be held to account. There needs to be justice for these workers.
My understanding is that there's only 300 odd inspectors of Transport Canada. I don't know if Jason or Rob, correct me if that's wrong. There was a call today for more regular inspections of vessels like these. But it would seem with that many inspectors that maybe it's not within the ability of Transport Canada to do that right now. Do you think there needs to be more funding so that they can actually keep up with that level of work and have sort of more routine oversight?
Absolutely. Transport Canada is in charge of ensuring that these industries are protecting workers, and yet they have far too few boots on the ground. There are far too few inspections. We need a strong regulator that's present and on the ground doing these inspections and holding companies accountable. And maybe I'll just ask if Jason wants to comment on that as well. He's very familiar with the inspection regime.
Yeah, unfortunately, Transport Canada hasn't had the resources to fulfill its mandate for generations. It's nothing new on all sectors. 300 marine safety inspectors across Canada in all modes of marine transportation, just for their concentrated campaign that they're launching here on the West Coast for inspections. They have to steal inspectors from the northern and prairie regions, but unfortunately those people have to go back to their regular day jobs, and they're only here for this small time. They really need a dedicated small vessel inspection team. You've got over 1,000 under 15-ton gross ton vessels here on the West Coast. Even under that regime, with 300 inspectors doing it, it would take you years, right? If they were all doing it, but they're not. So we need a dedicated team of people that actually experts in their field. The wages need to be comparable. Currently, Transport Canada is doing a recruitment drive, but they're looking for, I think the wages around $80,000, but unfortunately, a commercial captain here on the West Coast would almost double that in wages. So how would any person with a 150-ton master's certificate decide that they're going to go work for Transport Canada for half the wage they can earn while they're working commercially as a captain? So there's a disconnect between Ottawa and the West Coast, and what is a national program versus what is a regional problem. And I think that they need to think regionally as opposed to nationally, because this is where the problem is here. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I guess I'd have a question for Jenny and Judy. We have some answers today, but I wonder what outstanding questions you two still have about the circumstances of this Ingenika and Ingenika.
Well, I think just the fact that there's been previous recommendations and that Transport Canada hasn't acted on them in a mandatory manner. I mean, voluntary, proposed, all those words are not going to save lives. So my question is, why have they never implemented any recommendations, these strong recommendations previously?
And for me, it's the try to understand why the sentencing and the legal fines are so low for these companies to commit something as heinous and be charged with something so minimal. In other countries, the fines are so much more than in Canada, and they're protected under the workers' work safe, and it's not good. We got to get out of that. So companies and corporations are being held liable and thinking twice about being negligent in their operations.
Anyone else here in person with questions for any of the speakers? Okay, with that, maybe, do we have any questions from Zoom, or are we?
Jeff Blackman, CFNR.
Jeff Blackman, okay. Jeff, I think we're going to try to... Jeff, you can unmute yourself, and we're going to try to hear you here. We'll do our best. Is it connected to a speaker, or is it... You know what we're going to do?
Here. Hear the audio.
Jeff, you want to try speaking?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'll just repeat the question. Go for it.
Okay. So my first question is for you and anyone there who wants to answer it. Given the fact that we've heard so many times that Transport Canada has been issued recommendations in the past and basically been ignored, how much do you expect I know you demanded them to respond to it. How much do you expect them to actually do that and put in what need to be done? And why do you think it's taken so long for that to happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jeff. The question was, why has it taken Transport Canada so long to implement the recommendations put forward by the Transportation Safety Board? I think that's a very important question. It's really a question better directed to the Minister of Transport. He's in a position to implement these changes in the interest of worker safety, to protect lives. And yet we've seen in many transport industries far too little action to implement what are well-documented changes that would make life safer for these workers. So we're going to keep the pressure on the minister. We're going to demand that these recommendations from the report released today are implemented immediately. I know that the minister is under incredible pressure by the industrial lobby. There are companies that stand to make a lot of money by making certain decisions, including decisions that compromise worker safety. And worker safety should never be traded off against commercial objectives. So that's where the federal government comes in, that's where the minister comes in. We need strong rules that are properly enforced. We need independent regulator that's conducting adequate inspections. And if we do that, we can save lives. We can see a safer coast for all of the people who board vessels like this every day. So thanks for the question, Jeff, and we'll go to the next question on Zoom if there's anyone else.
KJ.
KJ? And does anyone else want to speak to Jeff's question from the room? Okay. KJ, go ahead.
So I'm reading through the backgrounder that was issued by Transportation Canada, and it states that this was a Class 3 investigation, and that Class 3 investigations are generally completed within 450 days. However, when I did the math, admittedly, I'm a journalist, not a mathematician. When I did the math, it's at 730 days currently. So that's almost double the time. Do you think that that is acceptable?
Well, we want to see these, and first of all, KJ, I think you said Transport Canada and the investigation was by the Transportation Safety Board. But we want to see timely investigations. And, you know, when it comes to the specific number of days, perhaps I'll ask Jason Woods to comment on the pace of the investigation and whether the feeling is that that could have been done more swiftly.
Yes, thank you, Taylor. That's very true, and I agree with that. Justice deferred is justice denied. 2 years to get these recommendations from Transport Canada when we've been calling this for 20 years. It's time. This was preventable. This industry is crying out for regulatory intervention. We need the assistance of the federal and provincial bodies to do their job. Just like everyone here is doing their job, just like I do my job. We all go to work. We all expect to come home safely to our friends and family. But the commercial interests need to be put in the back as opposed to worker safety, because clearly the corporate interest has been followed for quite a long time in Canada. We need to see better and breed. It's time.
The one thing I would add, KJ, to that answer is that the minister has special powers under legislation to put orders in place to protect workers. And we've seen the Minister of Transport in the past use those legislative powers in the wake of disasters to protect communities, to protect workers, to ensure safety. So 2 years have gone by since this disaster, and yet there have been no orders put in place to protect the workers that every single day get on board these small tugboats up and down the BC coast and go to work. And so, you know, I would have liked to have seen much swifter action to put interim measures in place while the Transportation Safety Board conducts its investigation. 2 years is a long time, and there's a lot that can happen in those months. So with that, I'll ask if there are any final questions from folks on Zoom or folks here in person. Okay.
Can you ask KJ if that's like a new hand or just legacy hand?
KJ, we see another hand. Is that a new hand or a legacy hand? Would you like to ask a follow-up? Okay.
It's an old.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming out today, everybody. We're going to keep pushing for change, and our hearts go out to the families of Troy and Charley. Thank you.